Today we're going to be talking about research and ethics within the biological level of analysis. And this is really going to start off the first of our three levels of analysis that we talked about before, cognitive, biological, and sociocultural, and not necessarily in that order. When we talk about the biological approach to psychology, really what we're focusing on is the hereditary influences and the individual specific workings of the human brain, nervous system, and hormones. And so within that, there's two really essential ideas that we want to think about. The first one is that it views particular behaviors like loss of temper, falling in love, criminal activity through the idea that our nature, our biology, truly influences those things and the appearance of those things. So, for instance, like criminal activity, perhaps it's due to chemical imbalances within the brain which affect your behavior, causing you to commit criminal actions. Obviously, that's something that would be incredibly important in terms of understanding why people do certain things. The second essential idea here is that it considers biological phenomena. It considers genetic information, various parts of the brain's intensity of engagement, levels of hormones in the body, in terms of how they affect our behavior. And obviously, with the example that I used just a second ago, you know, these two ideas sort of work off of each other because of that. When we talk about the principles of what we're going to be studying in this unit, there's a few different principles that we want to think about here. The first one is that there are biological correlates to behavior. There is this idea that there's this connection between our nervous and endocrine or hormone systems and the way that we feel and behave. Also, our brain and the workings of each part of that brain and how they interact with each other also affects our behavior. The second one is that research on animal behavior can be relevant to understanding human behavior. Part of what we'll be studying is not only evolution, but also the ways in which animals can sometimes, animals and their behaviors, especially certain animals like rats or monkeys, can really show a correlation to human behavior. And also, like we said here, if chimps have 99% of the DNA of humans and rats slightly less than 98%, then there probably are some comparisons that can be made between the behavior of humans and the behavior of animals. The third one, there is some genetic bases to individual behavior. Twins studied in different environments tell us much of what we know about how genetics affects behavior. And really the idea behind this is that the fact that twins have very, very similar and it's sometimes identical genetic makeups, if they are acting differently, then there might be some differences in how they behave. If they are twins that have been raised in different environments and they act similarly, then there's a biological basis. So really these different approaches, including the biological approach, are just trying to get an idea of what actually causes behavior to happen and how do these different levels of analysis sort of interact with each other. The fourth of these principles is that the endocrine and nervous system work together in processing and reacting to stimuli, and that, depending on how they sort of work together, can influence our behaviors. In terms of research methods used in the biological level of analysis, really we're going to be looking at three different types here that are used the most. The first one, laboratory experiments. Secondly, correlation studies. And then third, case studies. So with laboratory experiments within the biological realm, um, these are designed to establish the cause and effect relationship in connection to behavior. Obviously, when they are trying to find out more about the brain, um, they are trying to set up a true cause and effect relationship so that we can understand the individual workings of parts of the brain and how they affect behavior. Or like the example right here says, does the hormone cortisol make us forget things when we are stressed? And so to do that, you would want to find a cause and effect relationship where you are studying memory based on the appearance of the hormone cortisol. Experiments often involve a hypothesis that may not, or may not be accepted on the basis of findings, and includes at least two samples, a test sample and a control sample. Um, in the end, with the biological perspective, you may also use a control condition known as a placebo. Um, and so these may be used in biological perspective research as participants may feel they have an actual effect. However, there's certain ethical responsibilities that have to be considered, including consent and deception, when using placebos. The next type of research is correlation research. So these investigate the nature and degree of the relationship between two sets of values. But like we talked about in our research unit, this does not necessarily mean causation. A connection between two things does not mean that those two things cause each other. And so an example of this within biological research would be the use of brain scans. At times, our necessity to find out more about how the brain works does not necessarily match with the safety of participants. And so we need to use correlation research in order to get an idea of the connection between two things in areas where we couldn't necessarily actually experiment on someone or put them through the conditions necessary to experience those things. The last main type of method that we're going to talk about here are case studies. And case studies typically focus on the condition of one person or one situation over a period of time. And a famous one that we're going to talk about here is the story of HM. And I mentioned HM in the research unit, but this is a man who was experiencing extreme seizures, and was given a surgery to remove part of his hippocampus. And so HM becomes studied over 45 years to see the nature of this memory loss that he ends up experiencing after his surgery. And although we wouldn't have put HM through the process of just removing his hippocampus for any reason, um, we do study him because he provided us a lot more information about what the role of the hippocampus was in memory and how that affected behavior as well. And case studies in nature tend to be longitudinal, so they take place over a extended period of time, like I said in his case, 45 years or so, and rely on regular interviews and observations. Now, what happened to HM is not necessarily replicatable to other situations, but they do give us a knowledge of what could happen in these particular situations. And so this really raises the question and becomes a limitation of case studies in terms of how far the findings could be generalized. Obviously, not everyone is going to have their part of their hippocampus removed for extreme seizures. Now, the last thing I really want to talk about here when it comes to biological research are the ethical considerations. And the first of these really that come up quite a bit is the idea of informed consent. And so this arises in cases where the person is vulnerable because of brain damage or mental illness. Obviously, if you are studying biological concerns, there's going to be times where you're studying people who have suffered from afflictions of the brain, nervous system, what have you, where they may not be in the correct mental state to give full consent to things. The other issue where this comes into contact is with children. Um, they can only give consent through their parents, and that raises other, ethical concerns as to, what if their parent doesn't have their best interests at heart in some cases, and so can the child be studied for those reasons? And that's something that we'll continue looking at throughout the course of the year. The second one are animal studies. Proper consideration must be followed, such as that animals do not suffer or that suffering is kept to a minimum. Obviously, when you're doing things like testing drugs on animals, there's going to be times where the animal might die. And so in these cases, we're going to have to really consider whether or not the study was worth the suffering that the animal went through. Does this bring enough information to humankind for this animal to go through this particular suffering? The last one are placebos, and as I talked about before, the use of placebos, because the person does not know or the subject does not know that this is a fake drug, it really raises questions of deception and informed consent. And so those are things that we really want to be thinking about, not only in terms of ethical considerations, but also in terms of the research methods we talked about when considering the biological level of analysis. As we continue going through this year, we're going to continue looking at these different levels of analysis. So this is going to be a good start for us in terms of thinking about how different perspectives on psychology sort of take into context and study the field of psychology a little bit differently.